My name is Ray Dalio, and I want to share something that I believe most Americans are not fully prepared for. This is not about politics. It is not about predicting the exact date of a crisis. It is about understanding the forces that are shaping our future. Throughout my career, I have spent decades studying how economies rise and fall, how debt cycles develop, and how great nations navigate periods of prosperity and decline. What I have learned is that history follows patterns. The names change, the technology changes, and the people change, but the underlying mechanics remain surprisingly similar. Today, I see several of those patterns appearing in the United States, and I believe they deserve serious attention. Most Americans are focused on their daily lives. They are working hard, paying bills, raising families, and trying to build a better future. They hear about inflation, interest rates, government spending, and national debt, but these topics often feel distant. They seem like problems for politicians, economists, and financial experts. But the reality is that these issues affect everyone. They affect the value of your savings, the cost of your mortgage, the strength of your retirement account, and ultimately your standard of living. The biggest mistake people make is assuming that large economic problems can always be postponed without consequences. History shows us that they cannot. The United States has accumulated an enormous amount of debt. Every year, the government spends more money than it collects. To cover the difference, it borrows. This process has continued for many years. At first, borrowing seems harmless. In fact, it can be beneficial. Borrowing can help support economic growth, finance important projects, and provide stability during difficult times. But when debt grows faster than income for a prolonged period, problems begin to emerge. The debt itself is not the issue. The issue is the rate at which it is growing and whether the economy can continue supporting it indefinitely. Imagine a family that earns $100,000 a year but spends $130,000. At first, the family can borrow the difference. They can maintain their lifestyle and even appear financially healthy. But over time, the debt grows. Interest payments become larger. More income must be devoted to servicing old debt instead of improving the family's future. Eventually, borrowing becomes a necessity rather than a choice. That is when financial stress begins. Nations can experience similar dynamics, although on a much larger scale. One reason America has been able to borrow so much is because the U.S. dollar serves as the world's primary reserve currency. Countries around the world hold dollars, conduct trade in dollars, and invest in dollar-based assets. This creates strong demand for U.S. government debt. It is a tremendous advantage, but history teaches us that no reserve currency remains dominant forever. Before the dollar, the British pound played a similar role. Before that, other currencies held positions of global importance. Economic leadership changes over time, and nations that assume their advantages will last forever often find themselves surprised. Today, the United States faces a challenge that is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Interest payments on the national debt are rising rapidly. Think about that for a moment. The government is now spending enormous amounts of money simply to pay interest on money that has already been borrowed. Those interest payments do not build roads. They do not improve schools. They do not strengthen infrastructure. They are simply the cost of carrying existing debt. As debt grows, those costs rise. And as those costs rise, the need for additional borrowing increases. This creates a cycle that can become self-reinforcing. Many people believe that policymakers will simply solve the problem when it becomes serious enough. I wish it were that simple. The reality is that political systems often struggle to address long-term challenges because the incentives are focused on short-term results. Politicians are rewarded for delivering benefits today, not necessarily for making difficult decisions that may produce benefits years from now. As a result, debt problems tend to grow gradually until they become impossible to ignore. History is filled with examples of countries that experienced similar situations. Some managed their transition successfully, others did not. The difference often came down to whether leaders were willing to confront reality early. The longer a problem is ignored, the fewer options remain. That principle applies to individuals, businesses, and nations alike. Another issue that concerns me is the growing level of political polarization. Throughout history, periods of significant financial stress are often accompanied by increasing political conflict. When economic conditions become more challenging, people look for someone to blame. They divide into competing groups. Trust in institutions declines. Compromise becomes more difficult. We are seeing many of those trends today. Political divisions are not because of America's debt problem, but they make solving it more difficult. At the same time, geopolitical tensions are increasing around the world. Major powers are competing economically, technologically, and strategically. History shows that periods of rising debt often coincide with periods of international competition. These forces can reinforce one another. Economic weakness can create geopolitical challenges, and geopolitical challenges can create economic strain. Understanding these connections is essential because they shape the environment in which future decisions will be made. Many Americans assume that because the economy has recovered from previous crises, it will always recover quickly. But history does not guarantee that every recovery will follow the same path. There have been periods when economies struggled for years. There have been periods when inflation remained elevated. There have been periods when financial assets produced disappointing returns. There have been periods when governments faced difficult choices regarding taxes, spending, and social programs. Assuming that the future will look exactly like the recent past is one of the most dangerous mistakes an investor can make. This brings me to inflation. Inflation is often misunderstood. Many people think inflation simply means prices are rising, but inflation is really about the purchasing power of money. When governments borrow heavily and central banks create more money to support the system, the value of that money can decline over time. Even moderate inflation can have a significant impact on savers. If your money loses purchasing power year after year, your wealth is quietly eroded. That process may not be dramatic, but it can be incredibly powerful over long periods. The challenge facing many Americans today is that they are caught between rising costs and financial uncertainty. Housing is expensive, healthcare is expensive, education is expensive. At the same time, many people feel that their income is not keeping pace with these increases. This creates frustration and anxiety. It also makes households more vulnerable to economic shocks. When financial cushions are thin, even small disruptions can create significant hardship. So, what should people do? The answer is not panic. Panic is never a good strategy. Instead, focus on resilience. Build savings. Reduce unnecessary debt. Diversify investments. Develop valuable skills. Prepare for a range of possible outcomes rather than betting everything on a single scenario. The goal is not to predict the future with perfect accuracy. The goal is to be prepared regardless of what happens. One lesson I have learned over the years is that successful investors think differently from the crowd. They do not simply follow headlines. They do not assume that current conditions will continue forever. They study history. They analyze incentives. They look for patterns. Most importantly, they remain humble. They understand that uncertainty is a permanent feature of life. Instead of trying to eliminate uncertainty, they prepare for it. When I look at America today, I still see tremendous strength. I see innovation. I see entrepreneurship. I see world-class companies. I see talented people. I see extraordinary resources. The United States remains one of the most powerful and dynamic nations in the world. But acknowledging those strengths does not mean ignoring the challenges. In fact, true optimism requires honesty. Real strength comes from confronting problems directly, rather than pretending they do not exist. The coming years may require difficult decisions. They may require adjustments that many people would prefer to avoid. They may require leaders to make choices that are politically unpopular but economically necessary. The sooner those realities are recognized, the greater the chances of achieving a positive outcome. The greatest risk is not that America faces challenges. Every nation faces challenges. The greatest risk is complacency. It is the belief that problems can always be postponed, that debt does not matter, that history no longer applies, and that the future will automatically resemble the past. History teaches us otherwise. Reality eventually matters. Fundamentals eventually matter. Debt eventually matters. Most Americans are not prepared because they are focused on today's headlines, while ignoring the larger forces operating beneath the surface. The debt cycle is one of those forces. It develops slowly, almost invisibly, until the consequences become impossible to ignore. By the time the average person recognizes what is happening, many opportunities to prepare have already passed. That is why I believe understanding these issues is so important, not because I want people to be afraid, but because I want them to be informed. Knowledge creates options. Preparation creates resilience. And resilience creates opportunity, even during difficult times. The future has not been written yet. America still has choices, but choices become more limited as time passes. The trends we see today are warning signals, not destiny. Whether those warnings are heeded will play a major role in determining what happens next. History has shown us what can happen when debt grows too large, when divisions become too deep, and when difficult decisions are delayed for too long. The question now is whether we are willing to learn those lessons before circumstances force us to learn them the hard way. That is the challenge ahead, and that is why I believe most Americans are not ready for what is coming.